At 11 p.m., October 23rd, 1942, El Alamein. 800 British guns fired at once. The desert shook. From one end of the 40-mile front to the other, the sky turned a continuous, pulsing orange. Men in forward-slit trenches pressed themselves flat against the earth. The concussion moved through the sand like a wave, rattling teeth, rattling helmets, rattling the air itself. The barrage would continue for 5.5 hours. 1,000 tons of shells falling on German and Italian positions across the Egyptian desert. General Bernard Montgomery was in his command caravan when it started. He'd been over the attack plan so many times he barely needed to look at it. He knew where his divisions would move. He knew where the Axis minefields were, their depth, their layout, their gaps. He knew where the German fuel dumps sat. He knew that Rommel wasn't even in Africa. He knew that the man currently commanding the Axis forces, General Georg Stumme, had taken over only days earlier. He knew that the fuel convoy the Germans were expecting, the tanker Proserpina, had been sitting on the bottom of the Mediterranean for 2 weeks. He knew all of this because a machine in Buckinghamshire had told him. Not through a spy network, not through a captured prisoner, through a process so secret that Montgomery himself was only permitted to know its output, not its source. The intelligence was called Ultra, and it came from a place the Germans had no idea existed. Bletchley Park was a Victorian country estate 50 miles north of London. Before the war, it had been the home of the financier Sir Herbert Leon, a rambling red-brick mansion surrounded by 17 acres of grounds. In 1938, the British Government Code and Cipher School quietly purchased it. By 1939, the first code breakers were moving in. They did not look like warriors. They were mathematicians, linguists, chess players, crossword champions, classicists, historians. They arrived in tweed jackets carrying battered suitcases. Some were barely out of university. They moved first into the mansion, and then, as the operation expanded far beyond any original estimate, into a growing collection of wooden huts spread across the ground. Hut 3 handled translation and analysis of decoded Army and Luftwaffe messages. Hut 6 focused on breaking those messages in the first place. Hut 8, led by Alan Turing, worked on naval enigma, the hardest and most strategically critical problem of all. The machine they were attacking was the Enigma. Germany's military used it for almost every encrypted communication. It was an electromechanical device roughly the size of a typewriter, fitted with 3 to 5 interchangeable rotors, a plug board that scrambled connections between letters, and a reflector at one end. Each time a key was pressed, the rotors advanced, meaning the encryption changed with every single character typed. The total number of possible settings ran into the quintillions. German cryptographers had calculated it would take longer than the age of the universe to crack Enigma by brute force alone. They were right, as far as it went. Brute force wasn't the approach. The code breakers at Bletchley were looking for something different. They were hunting patterns, not in the encryption, but in the human behavior surrounding it. German operators who sent morning weather reports in the same rigid format every day. Operators who used predictable cribs, opening phrases the British could guess in advance. Operators who, under boredom and pressure, cut corners with protocol. These small human failures opened narrow cracks in an otherwise solid mathematical wall. The theoretical groundwork had arrived from Poland. 3 mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, had broken earlier versions of Enigma and passed their methods to British and French intelligence just weeks before Poland fell in September 1939. What they handed over was a lifeline. Without it, Bletchley might have needed years longer to get started. Years Britain didn't have. Turing took the Polish bomb design and improved it fundamentally. Gordon Welchman added an innovation called the diagonal board, which multiplied the machine's efficiency dramatically. By 1941, functional bombs were running. Each machine stood nearly 6 feet tall, weighed a ton, and housed 108 rotating drums representing possible Enigma rotor configurations. When the drums stopped and a result emerged, an analyst checked it. If the output made grammatical sense in German, the decrypt moved forward. But the intelligence that came out of those bombs didn't simply go to whoever asked. At the top of the distribution chain was Stuart Menzies, chief of MI6. Every morning, 7 days a week, Menzies personally carried a locked dispatch box to 10 Downing Street. Inside were the previous day's most valuable decrypts, translated, annotated, and organized by strategic relevance. Churchill received them before his chiefs of staff, before the cabinet, before almost everyone. Churchill called them his golden eggs. He told Menzies the goose that laid them must never be put at risk. That wasn't poetry. It was an operational directive with teeth. Protecting Ultra required a system that could, at first glance, seem almost self-defeating. Every piece of intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts had to be given a believable alternative source before anyone could act on it. If a submarine was located through a decoded signal, a reconnaissance aircraft had to fly out first, to independently discover it. If a supply convoy was identified, the attack had to appear to result from routine patrol, not foreknowledge. The intelligence had to be smuggled into reality, disguised as something ordinary. This added delay. It added complexity. And sometimes it meant that acting on the intelligence would reveal the source, and the decision was made not to act at all. Ships were allowed to be sunk. Convoys were permitted to reach port. Men died because using the intelligence would have cost more than staying silent. This was the brutal arithmetic of Ultra. Nowhere was that arithmetic more agonizing than in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were the single greatest existential threat to Britain between 1940 and 1943. They operated in coordinated groups, wolf packs, directed by radio from headquarters in Lorient. Between 1940 and early 1943, they sank millions of tons of Allied shipping. In March 1943 alone, they destroyed nearly 630,000 tons. Britain was running through supplies faster than ships could replace them. At the rate of losses that winter, the arithmetic pointed in one direction. Naval Enigma was harder to crack than Army or Luftwaffe traffic. It used an additional rotor, increasing complexity substantially. The Germans changed naval settings more frequently, and there were blackout periods, stretches when Bletchley lost the thread entirely, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. During those blackouts, convoy routing was essentially blind, and losses spiked hard. In May 1941, Commander Joe Baker Creswell and the crew of HMS Bulldog changed everything temporarily. They boarded the stricken submarine U-110 before it sank, retrieving Enigma settings, code books, and an intact machine. The German crew were taken prisoner and carefully isolated, kept from any information suggesting their boat had survived long enough to be captured. The Germans never knew. For a critical period, Bletchley read U-boat traffic in something approaching real time. Then the settings changed. The blackout returned. But the methods, the cribs, the analytical frameworks, all of it remained. By late 1942 and into 1943, the codebreakers were breaking back in. Combined with improved radar, long-range Liberator aircraft, and aggressive direction-finding operations, the intelligence picture sharpened. Convoys were rerouted around known patrol lines. U-boats that surfaced to recharge batteries were met by aircraft appearing, seemingly from nowhere, out of clear ocean. German Admiral Dönitz suspected his communications might be compromised. He raised it with his intelligence staff. They investigated and concluded Enigma was secure. The losses, they determined, were due to Allied radar advances. This conclusion, almost certainly the wrong one, kept the Atlantic campaign running at full intensity for 2 more years. If Dönitz had acted on his suspicion and overhauled his communications entirely, the ultra advantage might have collapsed overnight. He didn't. The golden eggs kept coming. If this kind of deep history is what you're after, subscribe before we go further. This is exactly what this channel covers every week. By 1943, Bletchley Park had grown from a handful of talented eccentrics into one of the largest covert operations in British history. Over 8,000 people worked there in rotating shifts, around the clock, every day of the week. The wooden huts had multiplied across the grounds. Bomb machines now numbered in the hundreds. Entire departments handled different German services: Army, Navy, Luftwaffe, SS, diplomatic traffic. 8,000 people. One secret. The discipline required to maintain that was extraordinary by any standard. Workers signed the Official Secrets Act, but beyond the legal obligation, they absorbed a culture of absolute silence. They didn't discuss their work in the canteen. They didn't mention it in letters home. When they went on leave, and their families asked what they did all day inside that big house in the countryside, they deflected. They changed the subject. They talked about anything else. Some of them maintained this silence for 30 years after the war ended. Some told no one at all, not even their spouses. They won the war in secret, and then went home and stayed quiet about it for the rest of their lives. The work itself offered no visible reward. There were no medals from Bletchley, no victory parades mentioning the code breakers. When a convoy arrived safely in Liverpool, the men who had helped route it around the wolf packs moved straight to the next intercept. The victories were invisible, the contributions entirely deniable. Then 1943 brought a new problem that pushed even Bletchley's capabilities to their absolute limit. The Germans introduced the Lorenz cipher machine for their highest-level communications, the messages passing directly between Hitler and his senior field commanders. Lorenz was not Enigma. It was a fundamentally different design, dramatically more complex, and the traffic it produced was initially almost impenetrable. A young mathematician named Bill Tutt changed that. Working from intercepted traffic alone, over several months, through pure logical deduction, he reverse-engineered the complete structure of the Lorenz machine without ever having seen a physical example. His colleagues were stunned. One senior Bletchley officer later described it as the greatest single intellectual achievement of the entire war. From Tutter's analysis, engineer Tommy Flowers built Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer. It filled a room. It ran on 1,500 vacuum tubes. It processed punched paper tape at 5,000 characters per second. Operational by December 1943, it could attack Lorenz encrypted traffic at speeds no human team could approach. The messages Colossus decoded were the most sensitive in the entire German command structure. Hitler's direct communications with his generals, strategic decisions before they became orders, orders before they became troop movements. And this was the intelligence feeding into the planning for Operation Overlord. The D-Day planners knew through Lorenz decrypts and Enigma traffic combined the precise disposition of German forces in France. They knew which divisions were positioned near Normandy. They knew which were concentrated near Pas-de-Calais. They knew the strength of the Atlantic Wall at specific sectors. And they knew, with extraordinary clarity, that German High Command believed the main Allied landing would fall at Calais. Operation Fortitude, the Deception, had constructed a fictitious army group in southeast England, with Patton nominally at its head. Massive volumes of false radio traffic were generated. Double agents fed fabricated intelligence to Berlin, and Ultra allowed the Allies to read German assessments of all of it in near real time. When the decrypts showed that Wehrmacht commanders had swallowed the deception entirely, that armored reserves were being held near Calais waiting for the real blow, the Allied planners knew the window was open. June 6, 1944. 156,000 men crossed the Channel. The beaches were defended. The fighting was savage. Men died in the water, in the surf, on the sand, against the sea wall. But the panzer divisions that could have driven the landing back into the sea were not there. Hitler, convinced that Normandy was a feint, held them back. He waited for the main attack at Calais. It never came. That hesitation, measured first in hours, then in days, was the margin between catastrophe and survival. Ultra had helped engineer it, and not one German commander, not in 1944 and not for years afterward, understood how. After the war, German generals wrote their memoirs. They blamed Hitler's interference. Supply failures, Allied air power, bad luck. Some suspected a penetration of their intelligence services but couldn't identify it. Rommel, who never understood why the British always seemed to know, was forced to suicide by Hitler in October 1944. He died without the answer. They blamed everything except the truth. The truth came out in 1974, when F. H. Hinsley published the first volume of the official history of British intelligence. Ultra was finally declassified. 30 years after the war, the world learned what had been happening inside those wooden huts in Buckinghamshire. The reaction from those still living who had been there was complicated and, in many cases, painful. The habit of silence had been trained too deeply in some of them. Some found it almost impossible to speak, even then. Others felt relief. Others felt something quieter, the late incomplete satisfaction of finally being permitted to exist in the history they had helped shape. Dilly Knox died in 1943, before he could see what his early work became. Alan Turing was prosecuted by the British government for homosexuality in 1952 and died in 1954, almost certainly by suicide. The country that had relied on his mind to survive the war stood by and watched his destruction. Gordon Welchman spent his later years fighting the intelligence establishment just to write honestly about what he'd been part of, and died in 1985, partly broken by the experience. These were not clean legacies. The institution that asked these people to save the country and then asked them to disappear had not covered itself in honor. That poor lot deserved far more than history gave them in time. But what they built survived all of them. Colossus was the direct ancestor of every modern computer. The mathematical methods pioneered at Bletchley formed the foundations of modern cryptography. The doctrine of signals intelligence, breaking enemy communications and exploiting them with systematic precision, became the cornerstone of every major intelligence service in the Western world after 1945. GCHQ, the NSA, the signals agencies of every NATO partner. All of them trace a direct line back to those huts, back to those bombs clicking through settings in a country house in Buckinghamshire. 800 guns fired along the El Alamein front on the night of October 23, 1942. Montgomery won the battle. Rommel retreated. Churchill told the nation it was the end of the beginning. It was. But he couldn't explain the real reason why. Not honestly, not for 30 more years. The golden eggs were still being laid. The goose was still alive. And 8,000 people who could have told the truth went home in silence and stayed that way. The war was won in the open, by armies and navies and air forces. But the shape of that victory, the timing, the precision, the margin between success and disaster, was decided quietly, in cold huts, by people whose names the world didn't know, solving problems the world didn't understand, keeping a secret that the world wasn't allowed to hear. They did it because they were asked to, because they understood what losing would mean, because the work itself demanded it. And the world they protected, the world that came after, was built on what they did in that silence. Every encrypted message sent today, every secure communication protecting infrastructure, finance, medicine and defense, every protocol that keeps modern information safe from those who would break it. Somewhere inside those bomb drums, clicking through rotor settings in a country house that almost no one knew existed, the shape of everything that came after was being decided. And almost nobody knew